On May 11th, 1910, 136 men and boys never returned from the Wellington Pit in Whitehaven. After an explosion and fire broke out underground, authorities chose to seal the mine completely, blocking the ventilation shafts with solid brick walls to starve the flames of oxygen. But that decision may have also sealed the fate of every miner still trapped inside. Who, if anyone, would be held criminally responsible for what happened? This was the deadliest mining disaster in Cumbria's history. As always, viewer discretion is advised. If you are locked in and ready to see how the system failed these men, comment the word "ready" right now. Let's get it. Whitehaven in 1910 was, above all else, a coal town. The prosperity of the community had been tied to the mining industry for well over a century by the time this story takes place, and nearly everyone in the town had some connection to the collieries. A father, a brother, a son, a neighbor. The Wellington Pit, officially operated by the Whitehaven Colliery Company, was the most significant of these operations. From the surface, the mine was marked by distinctive castle-like buildings designed by architect Sidney Smirke, and there was even a chimney that still stands today, known locally as the Candlestick. But the real scale of the Wellington Pit could only be understood by going underground. The main haulage road, known simply as the Main Road, extended approximately 4 miles out beneath the Irish Sea to the west. Perpendicular tunnels branched off from this central artery to extract coal from the surrounding seams. The mine reached depths of close to 1,000 feet at its lowest points, and the entire operation was divided into working districts numbered 3, 5, and 6. At any given time, the pit employed around 723 men and boys, working in 3 rotating shifts around the clock. Child labor laws in the early 20th century were significantly less restrictive than they are today, and so teenage boys were a routine part of the workforce. Because the mine was so deep and so vast, mechanical ventilation was not a luxury, but an absolute necessity. The main fan that drove air down the main road was 24 feet in diameter and rotated 126 times per minute. It had to be that powerful. Without constant, controlled airflow, the atmosphere underground would become lethal within hours. The Wellington Pit was also known to be what miners called a gassy mine, meaning that naturally occurring methane, referred to as fire damp, regularly seeped into the workings from the surrounding coal seams. Because of this, strict protocols were in place. Explosives were only permitted in non-coal areas. Miners were restricted to using electrically locked safety lamps rather than open flames. Inspections were carried out regularly, and the reports filed in the days before the disaster found the mine to be in safe working order. On the 21st, 22nd, 23rd, and 30th of March 1910, appointed workmen conducted formal inspections under the Coal Mines Regulation Act. Their signed certificate confirmed that all working places, shafts, levels, airways, machinery, and exit points had been examined and found satisfactory. The system, on paper, was functioning as intended. May 11th began as an ordinary evening shift. The back shift had finished their work underground, and the night shift was descending to take their places. At around 6:30 in the evening, the first group from the back shift had already been raised to the surface and had gone home. A second group of approximately 60 men had arrived at the bottom of the shaft when something changed. The air reversed direction. Large clouds of dust rolled toward them from the darkness behind them. They moved toward the shaft, and some went immediately to inform the manager at the pit top that something serious had occurred in the workings below. The time was approximately 40 minutes to 7 in the evening.
A pocket of fire damp, naturally occurring methane gas, had ignited somewhere in the tunnels. The exact source of the ignition was never definitively established. It may have been a faulty safety lamp or a smoldering fire already present underground. The initial explosion of methane was violent, but it triggered a second and far more destructive event. The shock wave disturbed the fine coal dust that had settled over months and years across every surface of the mine: the floors, the walls, the timber support beams, and the tunnel ceilings. When that dust ignited, the result was a rolling, expanding explosion that traveled through the narrow tunnels with tremendous and lethal force. Heavy timber roof supports were shattered. The ventilation doors, which controlled the flow of breathable air through the mine and were essential to keeping the workers alive, were blown off their hinges and destroyed. For those closest to the point of ignition, there would have been no warning and no time. In the number 5 district, 33 men gathered together on the level. Their deputy, Hugh McAllister, attempted to lead them to safety through the ventilation doors toward the incline. He found it impossible. Smoke was pouring down from above. He then tried leading the men out through the return airway, but after walking for some distance, the heat became so severe that they were forced to turn back. When McAllister tried the ventilation doors again, he failed a second time. 2 of the men, William O'Prey and Jay Lucas, chalked a message onto the ventilation door. It read simply, "Cannot go any further." At around 9:30 that evening, a miner named John Weir suggested that he and a volunteer attempt to push through the smoke on the incline. A man named George Kenmore agreed to go with him. The 2 men made their way through debris that the blast had scattered across the roadway. They reached a point near the friction gear where they found a smoldering fire on one side of the tunnel and flames on the other. They pushed further up the incline until they found fresh air. After resting briefly, they tried to return the way they had come, but found it was no longer possible. They continued upward and encountered 2 other men, Ben and Henry, at around 10 in the evening. At the time Weir and Kenmore left the group in number 5 district, at roughly 9:35 in the evening, those 87 men were still alive. Weir and Kenmore had passed the fire near the friction gear at approximately 10 o'clock, and according to later accounts, at that moment, with a fresh rescue team, the fire could have been addressed with reasonable effort. But the timing of what happened on the surface meant that this window was not taken. Above ground, managers and officials had been gathering since the alarm was first raised. Mr. Steele, the mine manager, Mr. Blair, the assistant general manager, Mr. Hanlon from the miners' agent office, and Mr. Mathers, the workmen's delegate, all arrived on the scene. Attempts were made to divert the smoke by opening a passage from the intake to the return airway and using brattice cloth to divide the incline into 2 channels, one carrying fresh air inward and the other carrying smoke out. For a time, this method allowed rescuers to advance about 140 yards from where they had first encountered the smoke. An overman named Thomas Graham was frustrated with the approach. He proposed an alternative plan to the undermanager, Mr. James Henry. Shut off the main intake entirely at a point above the smoke, redirect all the ventilation through the south back dip road, and use that route to reach the fire and deal with it directly. His proposal was considered, but by the senior officials present, rejected as impractical. Overnight and into May 12th, the families of the trapped miners arrived at the Wellington Pit in growing numbers. Word spread quickly through Whitehaven, and throughout the night and into the early morning, thousands of people gathered in silence outside the mine entrance.
By the time the sun rose, rescue teams had managed to bring out a total of 7 survivors. The news was grim. Most of the men were believed to be confined in working areas more than 3 miles from the main shaft.
HM Inspector of Mines, Mr. J.B. Atkinson, arrived at the colliery between 3 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon of May 12th. The heat underground had by then become very intense, and fearing that a second explosion was possible, the inspector withdrew all personnel from the pit. That same night, at 11 o'clock, 2 specialist rescue operators named Thorne and Littlewood arrived with their breathing apparatus and were taken underground. They were unable to advance more than 80 yards into the smoke before being forced to withdraw. A further consultation was held in the colliery offices at the surface. Present were Mr. Atkinson and 2 other HM inspectors, Abbott and Leake, along with the mine manager, the manager of the nearby Wellington Pit, and other officials. The conclusion reached at that meeting was one that would be disputed and mourned for years afterward. It was decided that further attempts to reach the entombed workmen were too dangerous to continue, and that airtight brick stoppings should be constructed in both the intake and return airways to cut off the ventilation to the fire. The construction of these brick walls began on May 13th. A stopping was built in the intake airway, and a similar one followed in the return airway in the days that came after. At the time the decision was made and the walls began to go up, there were 136 men and boys sealed inside. 51 in the number 3 district, 26 in the number 5 district, and 59 in the number 6 district. The following morning, around 3,000 miners from surrounding towns arrived in Whitehaven's city center. They had come with the intention of forcing officials to resume the rescue. When the group reached the mine entrance, they found police blocking the way. Some climbed the walls in an effort to push past, but ultimately, no one entered the pit. When tempers had settled, 3 representatives from the group were permitted to meet with J.B. Atkinson and the other authorities to make their case. They argued passionately for the rescue to resume. Atkinson listened, and then told them plainly that the men inside were gone, and that sending anyone else into the mine for any purpose other than completing the walls would only add to the death toll. The 3 men returned to those waiting outside and shared what they had been told. The families who had kept a silent vigil through the night were, by some accounts, distressed by the commotion the arriving miners had caused. To those who had been waiting, the disruption only added to a grief that was already beyond bearing. The walls continued to be built. As the workers laid each course of brick, many of them had to remind themselves of what they had been told, that the men inside were already gone. It was the only way to continue. Before the final wall was completed, several of the mine's managers made one last descent carrying breathing apparatus to try to locate the source of the fire. They advanced to roughly the halfway point of where they believed the fire to be before the fumes became overwhelming and they put on their helmets. A little further along, the canary, one of them was carrying in a cage, fell from its perch. The use of canaries as early indicators of carbon monoxide poisoning was a long-established practice in coal mining. Their respiration rate makes them sensitive to the gas well before humans feel its effects. The bird's collapse was confirmation of what the air analysis had already suggested. The tunnels ahead were no longer compatible with human life. The managers pushed on with their helmets, but eventually encountered partial cave-ins and intense heat that made any further progress impossible. Based on what they observed, they recommended that 2 additional walls be built, as it was possible that some of the collapsed sections had opened access to lower levels, which might have continued to feed oxygen to the fire. Those additional walls
were also constructed. When the last brick was laid in the last wall, the workers left the Wellington Pit. The mine sat sealed and silent from May 1910 until the end of September of that year. Throughout those months, smoke continued to rise from the air intake vents each day, a slow and constant reminder of what had happened and of who was still down there. When the smoke finally cleared and officials were satisfied that the fire had been extinguished, teams returned to the pit and began tearing down the brick walls. What followed was among the most difficult work any of those men would ever undertake. The recovery of the bodies, most of which were badly decomposed, burned, or both, was carried out over a period of weeks. As the teams worked their way through the affected districts, they found evidence that many of those inside had survived the initial explosion and had lived for some time afterward. Chalk messages were found on the steel pit doors, handwritten words from men who had waited in the dark for a rescue that never came. The scene inside the mine revealed individual stories that are still remembered today. The youngest victim was a 15-year-old lamp carrier named Robert Garraway. A 44-year-old miner named Thomas McAllister was found with his arms around his 17-year-old son, James. They had died together. 5 other members of the McAllister family also perished in the same disaster, nearly destroying an entire family line. Another miner had removed all of his clothing, which was found folded neatly and placed beside him. As the bodies were brought up to the surface, they were laid in a row outside the mine entrance. Family members were brought forward to identify their loved ones. The disaster had left 85 women widowed and 260 children without fathers. A painful and unusual error occurred during the final stages of recovery. When the 135th body had been identified, there was only one person remaining who had not yet been accounted for. And yet, when the last body was examined, the identification did not match. By that point, the others had already been buried in local cemeteries. The mistake could not easily be undone. To this day, at least one of the men from the Wellington Pit is believed to be buried beneath the wrong headstone. The decision to seal the mine just 2 days after the explosion generated immediate and lasting controversy. Rumors spread through Whitehaven and beyond that the colliery owners had acted to protect the coal seams and their commercial interests rather than to save the men. The Miners' Federation was fiercely critical of the mine management, arguing that the absence of properly trained on-site rescue teams and the inadequacy of emergency preparations had directly cost lives. The matter reached the floor of Parliament. Home Secretary Winston Churchill addressed the question directly, defending the decision to seal the mine as one made on the advice of the Chief Inspector of Mines on the grounds that penetrating the fire had been physically impossible, and that to attempt it would have risked a second explosion, capable of killing the rescue workers as well. A formal public inquiry was held in November 1910. Its findings were significant. The inquiry concluded that the deaths had been caused by the initial explosion and by carbon monoxide poisoning, not by the sealing of the mine itself. The management was found not to have been guilty of negligence or of any breaches of the relevant statutes. However, the inquiry did not stop there. Its recommendations were sweeping. Better monitoring of ventilation, strict registers for the use of safety lamps, and perhaps most importantly, the mandatory establishment of trained rescue teams at collieries across the country. The disaster had exposed not a single act of malice, but a systemic absence of preparation that had left men with no means of help when help was most urgently needed. 64 individuals who participated in the rescue and recovery efforts received the King Edward Medal for bravery in industrial accidents. It is still the largest number ever awarded following a single incident. Today, almost nothing of the Wellington Pit remains on the Whitehaven coastline. The surface buildings are gone. The shaft has been filled. But the candlestick chimney still stands, visible from the shore, and a white lodge building remains nearby. They are quiet, unheroic memorials to what happened on and after May 11th, 1910. Whitehaven marked the 100th anniversary of the disaster with a week of commemorative events, including services and a parade. 136 men and boys went underground and did not return. Some of them left messages in chalk, the last words they would ever communicate, written on steel doors in the dark at the bottom of the sea. A father and his son died holding each other. A 15-year-old boy who carried lamps for the miners never saw another day. The town of Whitehaven grieved and rebuilt, as towns do, and the coal industry carried on, as industries do, but changed in ways that would eventually protect future generations of miners across the country. The question that the Wellington Pit disaster leaves behind is one that every industrial age has had to face and answer for itself. At what point does the cost of caution become the cost of human life? And who, in the end, is responsible for counting that cost before the ground breaks open? The safety of our systems is sometimes just a fragile line, and behind every collapse are stories that must never be allowed to fade into obscurity. We really hope to read your insights and analyses in the comment section below. Also, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon. This small gesture goes an incredibly long way in helping us share these stories with the community. Thank you for being here and holding space for these historical events today. Take care of yourselves, and we'll be back soon.